hello everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar National Indicator Frameworks and Voluntary National Reports on SDGs. So this is the third webinar in the series that is replacing the expert meetings on statistics for SDGs that were planned to be held last week in Budapest. But unfortunately, we are now sitting all in our homes and have the meeting in this way. The meetings are organized by the UNHCR Steering Group on Statistics for SDGs, and today's webinar will be moderated by Cara Williams from Canada and Miriam Blumers from Germany. By today, 200 people have registered for the webinars. In the previous ones last week, we had 107 people actually participating. So this shows that there is really a lot of interest, and we are hoping that these webinars are useful. Today we will discuss the national SDG indicators and also how countries have done the voluntary national review. A lot of attention is on the global SDG indicator list. However, the global indicators are often not enough to measure progress at the national level, because sometimes the indicators may not be relevant to the national context or may be already achieved. Priorities at country level may be different from the global ones. And also for the action at global level, much more detail is needed. And therefore, national indicators are needed, and these should be seen not as competing with the global ones, but as complementary. And it will be therefore very interesting to see how countries have gone about doing those national indicators, because they can be done in very different ways. Today's webinar has a very interesting structure. The webinar moderators have been courageous to use a new approach, so we will see how this will work, but it looks very interesting. And to allow some interactivity, we are going to use also during the webinar Mentimeter. So this is an application that allows to run an instant survey and then also to show those results to everyone. For using the Mentimeter, it will be good if you will have your mobile phone at hand. But it can be also used through web, through any internet browser. But in this case, then you need to switch between the WebEx and this Mentimeter, and then switch back to WebEx. Before giving the floor to the moderators, I would like to remind you of a few housekeeping items and rules that will make the webinar more enjoyable and effective for everyone. First of all, we are recording the webinar, and it will be available on the web afterwards. We are asking all participants to mute their sound and disable video when not speaking. So the panelists and presenters, when you will speak then, or presenters after the presentation, we are asking you to put on the video so that we can also all see you. But for everyone else, please disable the video. Please provide comments and questions via chat. These comments will be also recorded, and we will make available them after the webinar. So there also feel free to provide additional information, links to some important information, and so on. All papers and presentations are on the web in English and Russian, including some background papers that may not be even presented during the webinar. So with this, I wish to everyone a very interesting and useful webinar. We keep fingers crossed that technically everything will work, and I turn over the floor to Cara and Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. I'm going to try and share my screen now, so let's see if this will work. Can you see the title page of the slides?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you. I hope you all had a great weekend. So as Tina had mentioned, this is the third of the 4 UNECE seminars or webinars related to SDGs. And although we wish we could be with you all in person, we are happy to have the opportunity to talk to you about national indicator frameworks and voluntary national reviews today. Before we start, I'd just like to express my thanks to Tina and Stella, who've been amazing getting everybody organized for this and making sure that technology works. We've had some tests and they've been super helping us getting the Mentimeter set up. So today I'd also like to mention again that we're using Mentimeter to get some questions from our audience responses. So if you can go to menti.com, that's MENTI.com, and add the following code. It's 902465. That's menti.com 902465. So if you could register in there now, that would be great because we will be asking some questions. So it's a 2-part webinar. The first part will focus on national indicator frameworks, and I will moderate this and have some help from my colleague Eleanor Melanson, also from Statistics Canada. And the second half of the webinar will be moderated by Miriam Bloomers from Germany. And we have several countries that have agreed to take part in this webinar with us. We have Alexandra from Austria, Amit from Israel, Angela from Italy, Aurelia and Lilia from Moldova, Claire from France, and Doublet from Turkmenistan. So hopefully you have logged in now to Mentimeter because we'll be asking a question in just a minute. Okay, so we're gonna, we have lots of materials, and I invite you to go to the wiki because there are several documents, including this presentation and the reports that have been prepared by countries. We will not go through all of this material. So I do hope you have some time to look at it because there's a lot of resources in there. So the format's a little bit different than the previous 2 webinars. We're going to start with a short TED Talk type presentation from myself and my colleague Eleanor. We'll follow this by asking our panelists some questions to respond to related to national indicator frameworks. And then, of course, if there are any questions you would like to ask, please use the chat feature, and we'll have our panelists respond. The second part of the webinar, which Miriam will moderate, will begin with Miriam providing an overview of VNRs. Then Doublet from Turkmenistan and Amit from Israel will each do a short presentation related to their VNRs. Miriam will then do an interview type process and ask the remaining panelists some questions. Also, we'll use the chat. Okay. So let's get started. So this is the TED Talk portion, and my research on TED Talk said that a good TED Talk should have 4 things. It should be simple, clear, original, and entertaining. And you can judge at the end if we meet these criteria. So for the next few minutes, I hope that out of this you will understand why countries may choose to develop national indicator frameworks and how best to create one. So let's talk a little bit about background. We have the Global Indicator Framework, which has been developed to measure the 169 global targets, and the IAG SDG just completed the 2020 comprehensive review. The development of the global indicators was based upon global consultations and working with international organizations, countries, civil society, and other stakeholders. And while these indicators were developed to address global targets, some countries have also developed specific national indicator frameworks. And so what is a national indicator framework? It's a set of nationally defined indicators that respond to national priorities and needs related to the Sustainable Development Goals. In some cases, national indicators respond to the global targets, but in other cases, these indicators respond directly to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Some countries, such as Canada, have developed their own targets. We don't call them targets, we call these ambitions. So let's go to our first 2 Mentimeter questions, please. And that is the first question being, does your country have a national indicator framework? And Stella, can you please monitor the Mentimeter questions? So we'll give everybody a minute.
I just wanted to ask if everybody sees my screen where I have the Mentimeter presentation, the Mentimeter slide.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so we'll give, we have 33 that have responded so far. And as we see, 82% of those who have responded have said that they have, their countries have developed a national indicator framework that is different from the global indicator framework. So we'll give just another second for that. Okay, so we're getting a few more responses. We have 36 countries responding, but it seems to be that it's about 80% of countries that have developed national indicator frameworks and 20% of countries that have not. Okay, we'll wait one more second and then we'll go to question 2 on the Mentimeter. Okay, question 2. If you have answered yes, so of the 80% that have questions, how many indicators does your national indicator framework have? So we have a wide variety here. We seem to have from a 60, 289, 338, several with about 100. Wow. So really, really diverse number. I think seems to me that 60 is about the lowest number of the ones here. And quite a few countries have 100. So very interesting. Quite a large diversity of countries there. Okay, so I will go back to sharing my screen. Okay. All right, so let's talk about national indicator framework challenges. So this slide actually illustrates the global challenges that were faced in the development of the 2030 agenda. Having a bottom-up agenda is very inclusive, but it also makes it very, very complex. While a national indicator framework may not have the same breadth of interests, it will clearly have a number of domestic stakeholders. You will still have in a national context civil society, academia, the private sector, various departments within and ministries within government, and in some cases, various levels of government, for example, federal, provincial, state, and municipal. A whole of society approach and commitment is needed to achieve the SDGs, but even nationally, this adds an additional layer of complexity in the development of these indicators, as some groups will undoubtedly prefer measures that support their mandates or are relevant to a small segment of the population. For example, eliminating poverty is a goal that's universally accepted and agreed upon by all national stakeholders, but agreeing on the measures for a national indicator framework is not easy. As NSOs, our expertise in the measurements should lead the development of a national indicator framework, as there is no organization within any country that is better placed to assess the applicability not only of our own data sources in terms of data quality and appropriateness, but also to assess the quality of data from other organizations. for example, admin data and big data. We also have politics. In a perfect world, all government policies are evidence-based and follow the scientific method that make use of research and statistics at all steps, and determining where the need for government intervention is necessary, the identification of subpopulations that may require specific programming, and of course, statistics are needed in the monitoring and measurement of the effectiveness of these policies and programs. But in practice, that's not always what happens. Sometimes policies and priorities are driven by the government that's in power and the platforms on which they were elected, and not necessarily by need. This can result in a balancing act for the National Statistics Office as they work with government, but have to remain neutral and unbiased. So for this to be effective, statistical independence must be strictly respected and supported by all partners, and roles must be clearly defined and followed. For example, in Canada, it was mandated through the budget, through Treasury Board and Memorandum to Cabinet, that Statistics Canada would be responsible for the development of all indicators for the National Indicator Framework. Another political challenge comes from the underlying makeup of government systems and the jurisdictions. It is easier to implement a strategy and an indicator framework in a centralized country compared to a federated country. So for example, I use Canada as an example. There are different levels of government that have different powers and different responsibilities. For example, in Canada, health is a provincial responsibility, as is education. So in theory, and that Sustainable Development Goals should not be political, but in reality, it is very difficult to depoliticize this, especially when you have different political parties between the federal and provincial or state level, and different mandates. So measurement and reporting can also become contentious when the trends contradict key priorities of a governing party. For example, a government that pushes an agenda to combat climate change, but also provides significant subsidies to support the fossil fuel industry. So how do we set up an effective national indicator framework? I think the short answer is very carefully. The first step is priority setting. So what is the first priority? You need to identify the national priorities and the policy instruments that support this change. That's not the job of the NSO to set the priorities, but we should be working collaboratively with policymakers in order to identify data availability for the indicators which provide insights on national progress, and to collect, measure, monitor, and report on indicators once they've been chosen. Factors that need to be considered when developing SDG indicators, well, there are some trade-offs. Completeness versus simplicity. We need to maintain a balance between the need to encompass everything that is relevant or important and having a framework that is too large and complex. If everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And I think maybe the Global Indicator Framework shows that we have a little bit of that already. We have an indicator framework, and we have those 169 targets, which are sometimes so diverse and multidimensional that it's very hard to come up with concrete, simple measures for these. Another trade-off is relevance versus comparability. We need to maintain a balance between indicators that highlight different regional and specific issues versus comparable indicators at the national level. For example, in Canada, we are geographically very large, and this is a big challenge. Having an indicator framework that is static versus adaptive. This is a trade-off you need to think about. You need to maintain a balance between a framework of indicators that track today's progress to 2030 and a flexible framework that can incorporate important issues as they emerge. So for example, the type of thing that we'd have, such as a comprehensive review of your indicator framework, is probably a good idea so that you can adapt things but it can't be done too often. Should you have a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach? Maintaining a balance between a top-down driven framework of indicators and a framework of indicators that respects the diversity of the different perspectives is difficult. So you have to have a balance so that you can monitor something at a national level and something at for those subpopulations that are important. And then, of course, nonpartisan versus partisan. While the development of indicators for the global indicator framework and the national indicator framework, in Canada at least, were mostly not politicized, the voluntary national review and national policies that we've talked about a little bit tend to become very political processes, and these are led by policy departments. So, for example, in Canada's VNR, we were heavily involved, obviously, in the IAG and the National Indicator Framework development, but for the VNR, we were not really involved at all. And in fact, the first version of our VNR had no data at all. So it's very difficult to ensure on political processes that some robust, relevant, and non-partial data and information are there. So let's go to our next Mentimeter question. Stella, if you could bring that up. What is the biggest challenge that your country faced to data availability? Okay, for those who are not using Mentimeter, there are 4 responses: funding, lack of disaggregated data, capacity development or technical knowledge, or other. So it looks like it's pretty common that lack of disaggregated data was an issue. Funding seems to be an issue so far of 16%, and capacity development or technical knowledge between 18 and 22%. So we'll just let people have another minute or so to put in their information. Okay, so I think we can see, I think we have 41 participants, and about 45% of those said lack of disaggregated data. The next, followed by capacity development, was the next challenge, and other and funding each had 16%. All right. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, I think everybody can see it. Okay. So what are some best practices then when developing a national indicator framework? I think it's important to understand who is at risk of being left behind. The development of highly disaggregated indicator data can allow policymakers to easily identify vulnerable groups, sectors, and subnational regions and measure the effectiveness of targeted policy. However, of course, as the last question just shows, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. Policymakers want more granular data, but finding the most vulnerable is the hardest statistically to collect data on. We need to identify national priorities and align indicators to high-level national priorities. This can facilitate the work of the NSO. So if we understand what the national priorities are, we can leverage existing resources and funding mechanisms and inform further development and elaboration of indicators. We need to establish clear roles and responsibilities in the development of a national indicator framework. For example, it should be stated that the NSO is responsible for the development of national indicators. I'm sorry, Stella, is everything okay?
I think, dear colleagues, I think someone is not muted from the participants, and if so, I would like everyone to mute except the presenter.
Okay, thank you. So we need to establish clear roles and responsibilities, and we also need to understand who is at risk of being left behind. What are the vulnerable groups? Seniors, disabled, Indigenous people, etc. And also be aware that vulnerable groups may change in different domains. For example, decent work may not be an issue for the elderly, but a high priority for youth and the disabled. So keep that into consideration. Developing a defined system for elaborating national indicators makes the process of selecting national indicators more clear, concise, and transparent. Do data already exist at the national level, or do national indicators already exist? Are the global indicators sufficient as measures for some of the national priorities? If they are, these should be used. If not, then it is important to develop national indicators. Are data available at a disaggregated level? It's important to determine that. Be realistic. That does not mean that a country cannot be aspirational, but it does mean that you can't measure everything. I'm going to shortly turn it over to my colleague Eleanor, who will walk us through some of the similarities and differences of the national indicator frameworks we looked at. And when thinking about developing national indicator frameworks, I'd just like to leave you with a quote that I found when preparing that I thought might be a little bit relevant for this. Reports, statistics that say something hasn't happened are always interesting to me because, as we know, there are known knowns, there are things that we know we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are some things we do not know, but there's also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. So I think that essentially says that sometimes we can't measure everything. We measure what we can and what we understand, but we keep in mind that things are changing all the time, and we need to be coherent and understand that. So let's go to the final National Indicator Framework Mentimeter question. Stella, what are the trade-offs that your country made in the development of a National Indicator Framework? Okay, we're starting to get some responses so far. We have 8 countries responding, and it seems that relevance versus comparability and completeness versus simplicity are the very common trade-offs that were most often noted. We'll just leave a minute for other countries to respond to. Again, it looks like completeness versus simplicity is one of the major trade-offs that countries have noted here. Okay, Eleanor, can you walk us through the known knowns of the indicator frameworks that we looked at?
Sure. So as Kara mentioned, I'll be taking over. And part of our preparation for this webinar was to actually look at a sample of different national indicator frameworks from different UNECE countries. And to map those out and really take a look at what are the similarities, what are the differences, and how can we align those sorts of priorities. So one thing that we did notice was that each framework was refined at least slightly, meaning that it was at least slightly smaller than the global indicator framework. And I think that that was it's obviously clear from our responses on the last question, showing that simplicity versus completeness was a consideration, and that relevance versus comparability was also a consideration. Another thing that we noticed was that all countries that we looked at had, at least to some degree, an emphasis on vulnerable groups. So, of course, with it being really important to leave no one behind, and that being kind of an underlying pursuit of the goals, it was not surprising that all countries had desegregated for this, but it was, of course, positive to see that. Though I will mention that with that in mind, of course, every country has, as Kara already mentioned, different vulnerable groups. So for us in Canada, two of the bigger considerations were Indigenous people, rural and remote populations, the elderly, so on and so forth. And so highly desegregated data is, of course, also something that all countries mentioned. At least 50% of participants mentioned that that was a challenge at the national level. And I think that's for everyone, for the vulnerable groups, is a challenge that we're all trying to overcome. That was actually also a question that we received in the registration. There were a few questions speaking to how we can ensure to leave no one behind and how national statistics feed into that. And highly desegregated data is one of those really important ways that we as NSOs can feed into policy and can really inform that policy process to ensure that no one is left behind. The third thing that was noted was that while all countries used at least some global indicator framework indicators, there was a varying degree of the use of unique national indicators versus global indicators. Sometimes this ranged from being almost all global indicators versus almost or very few global indicators in the overall proportion, which could really mean a variety of things. That may mean that those were not considered relevant for various reasons at the national level. It could also mean that countries are really allocating their resources to try to first respond to the global indicator framework and then to leverage other national unique indicators. Regardless, though, it was kind of an interesting thing to see just the variance of how many of these were used for each country. The selection criteria, so almost all countries for which we reviewed the national indicator frameworks provided a specific selection criteria for choosing those indicators. And I think that's a really important baseline. And I apologize if for Israel or Turkmenistan, if there is actually a selection criteria, and I just wasn't able to find that. I will say that we found that to be a really important baseline because it provides these set expectations. Because as we all know, working with policy departments, working with policymakers, you really have to set specific expectations to what they can and expect to receive from us as informants to their policies and to the success of those policies and to measuring progress. And so one of the things that I think was really important in that was the selection criteria. It just sets a really specific, okay, it has to be existing data. The data has to be desegregated at least one level, whether that be geographic or by a specific population. So that kind of speaks also back to the desegregation. For the last really large trend that I noticed was progress reporting, and whether or not countries have started to openly provide progress reports on the measurement and I guess trends of the SDG indicators that they've selected. One really good practice that I noticed is from Germany, where the progress report is, and I'm sure many of you already are familiar with this, the the Sustainable Development Progress Report from Germany is actually using a weather outlook. And I think this is a really interesting way to make the findings accessible to all people looking at them. Like, everyone is able to understand that if it's sunny, things are going pretty well. If it's stormy, things are not going as planned or as expected, but that ultimately still remains a very nonpartisan way to be able to communicate that. And then, of course, there were some more substantial differences between. Kara, are you still showing the presentation or no?
No, Eleanor, we just see you.
Oh.
Do you want me to show? You want me to show the presentation?
Yeah, sorry, I thought you had it up that whole time.
Okay. No, as soon as you start talking, I lose my screen. So just hang on.
Okay, so as you can see, there were also some substantial differences between the countries, and I think that was also clear from the questions that were asked, just based on the different range and sizes of the National Indicator Framework, whether or not they use goals that are, or indicators that are specifically aligned to the Global Indicator Framework. And of course, the emphasis on different dimensions of sustainable development. So we've already kind of covered the size of the National Indicator Framework and the alignment, but I will say that there was some trends kind of that were obvious. Certain countries were placing more emphasis on health and kind of social indicators. Others were more focused on the environmental factors. And I think that there are a few different considerations to that as well, where if the selection criteria chosen for the National Indicator Frameworks required an underlying existence of the data, for example, that those indicators that are emphasized are probably just reflective of the fact that that data was already existing and readily available, and that there's probably development behind the scenes to develop the other components or dimensions of sustainable development, but that it also may relate back to, again, those policies and the priorities at the national level. Finally, there's a pretty large difference in the status of the National Indicator Framework. So whether or not it had been established early on, closer to 2015, here in Canada, we have developed our first iteration. The final iteration will be aligned to the rolling out of our National Sustainable Development Goal strategy. So you obviously see a variance in whether or not countries are already reporting because that indicator framework has already been solidified, or whether it's in development or progressing towards that. So our next little bit, we're going to just actually speak to specific countries on their experience. And these are the countries that we had mapped out in our National Indicator Framework review. So from Austria, we have Alex. Alex, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. So based on the feedback provided, Austria is currently reporting on roughly 170 indicators. Are there a subset of these that are used at the domestic level, or plans to develop a reduced size model, or is the focus mainly on improving the reporting of the global indicators?
No, the focus is on the national indicator set, where we have about 200 indicators, and we just check if these indicators are in line with the UN indicator proposal. more or less, not to the last letter down, but more or less if they are the same, then they get a category, and if not, we count them as additional indicators and they get a B category.
Okay, that's great. So you're already reporting on the progress towards these based on...
Yes, because sometimes there are some indicators that we have that are not in the UN list, but they are relevant for Austria, then we also take them.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And now we're going to send the floor to Amra from Bosnia and Herzegovina. In your VNR, you mentioned the use... Hi. In your VNR, you mentioned the use of Imagine 2030, where you worked with civil society groups to form an understanding of the country's baseline position. Can you tell us more about this and how it influenced your NSO's approach to reporting?
Okay. Imagine 2030 is actually an initiative that came up from the UN in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And before saying anything, I would like to say that in Bosnia we started to localize Agenda 2030 in 2017. So as you can see, there was this kind of time gap, for 2 years. So UN came up to this innovative approach, this Imagine 2030 initiative that was primarily used to advocate the SDG goals to broader public. So I was personally participating as a facilitator, but also as a participant, as a public servant. And because it grew up in having this broad public, more than 3,000 of people, we decided actually to choose what people had to say, the priorities that they thought that were relevant. We took it into consideration while drafting SDG framework in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in that particular process, we didn't have, let's say, close connection with NSOs. But later on, when we started to localize Agenda 2030, the first step that in 2017 was to fulfill this SDG dashboard that consists of all SDG targets, and we were coordinating with our National Statistics Office in fulfilling all these indicators and in terms of the availability, periodicity, and validity, and so on, and disaggregation level.
Right. Very interesting. I think that's a really good way to incorporate your civil society. It's always in a collaboration. Thank you.
Welcome.
Our next question is for Angela from Italy. And for that, we're wondering, what SDG data activities are you undertaking for 2020? And if you could describe these a little bit for everybody.
Thank you, Eleanor. Angela. We have already done 2 reports, and now we are going to disseminate the 3rd report, the mid of May. It is related and connected to our national statistical platform. So in the mid of May, we will have our 3rd report that there will be in Italian and in English, and our 8th dissemination of indicators. The core was to produce these indicators, these statistical measures, considering the 2020 review of SDGs indicators, and collaborating, working a lot inside the national statistical system with the other colleagues from the other agency, also from environmental agency. One of the points was to work a lot in this interinstitutional way and try to consider also administrative data when it is possible, to consider as much as it is possible the idea of leaving no one behind and increasing the disaggregation, and also to work and increasing disaggregation, considering in a special way the territorial disaggregation, because we have not only the national strategy, but also regional strategy, and so it is important to have regional data. And the other point is to work again on the analysis of interlinkages, and in this case, for the new report, we are going to consider interlinkages that consider the Green Deal in Europe, the well-being indicators, and also we are trying to analyze from the conceptual point of view the interlinkages considering the pandemic in Europe. So this will be this is in ongoing, and that this will be disseminated in a couple of weeks.
Right. I think we're all to determine how the pandemic will affect our statistical work and how that will affect the SDG indicators as well. Within your reporting, do you also use like a system of, I know Austria is using A, B, like a letter grade, Germany is using the weather forecasts. Are you using some kind of like grading system, or is it? We have also, and we did it for each goal. There is something like green, yellow, and red, and it is also synthesized to put all together the information. So there is some dedicated goal by goal, and also in the first chapter, this is a part that synthesized the effect of green or red. That's great.
For the indicators.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. In Moldova, we have Aurelia and Lila. Sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. And we're interested to know, you've noted that you have 87 national proxies. Can you explain a little bit about how your proxy indicators were selected? Whether these were based on data availability, or were these based on national priorities or other reasons?
Thank you, Eleanor, for the question. On behalf of the National Bureau of Statistics of Moldova, I will talk. My colleague Lilia is participating at the session, but still it is me to talk about it and to answer to your question. So, in fact, we in 2019 we made a second revision of our nationalized set of indicators, and this revision, in fact, was requested or needed from our point of view because of two considerations. So first of all, in 2016, when we made the first nationalization of indicators, we had one status of the distribution of global indicators by tiers classification. So we had a lot of indicators which were in the tier 2 or 3. That's why at that time in 2016, when we determined the status of our availability of a certain global indicator, we understood that we did not give the correct answer at that time. So that's why, because more methodologies, more global metadata were available already for much more global indicators, we consider that it's necessary to revise our nationalized list of indicators. The second aspect was that in 2016 in Moldova there was a central public administration reform which has made big changes in the structure of the government. As a result, a few ministries were united into one single ministry. The other ministries were cancelled at all, and that's why we have lost from our 2016 nationalized list of indicators the owners of all the data sources which were attributed to each of those indicators. So these were the two reasons why we made this revision. Our revision, in fact, resulted in such a big number of our nationalized indicators, 338 indicators. It is mostly because of the following things. So about 100 additional indicators we have got from analyzing the global indicators, which were in fact complex indicators. For example, such indicators as indicator 131 relating to social protection schemes in the country. We have divided that one indicator with one numbering in the global list into another 9 global divided indicators. So there are a few cases like this, which resulted in a much bigger number of nationalized indicators. So as it regards the proxy indicators, we have got them 87 indeed, and we attributed this classification of to those indicators, for example, in 4 cases. So in the case when we had indicators, global indicators related to Tier 3, for which we did not know the metadata, global metadata, in that case we had to propose our version of indicator, which would at least partially reflect the essence of the global indicator until the experts from the expert group will not develop those metadata for Tier 3 indicators. So this is one situation. The second situation was for the indicators for which we don't have the data source which is mentioned in the global metadata. For example, a victimization survey, we don't have it in the country. So instead of it, we had to apply to the administrative data sources and to propose our version of indicators to the global ones, which refer to this victimization survey as sources, right? So the third situation was applied to indicators for which, for example, we did not, in the existing sources in Moldova, which would comply with the sources recommended in the global metadata, we did not find those sources, our sources, using the same methodology as in global metadata. That's why we proposed the same sources, but producing data applying some national methodologies. So these were the main categories of cases or situations when we had to propose alternatives to the global indicators. I would like to say that in all these cases, for all the 87 indicators, we tried to maintain the general context of the target and of the global indicator. That's why it was a way for us to solve the lack of availability of global indicator at the national level.
Great. I think for all frameworks, at least from our experience, the challenge for everyone is trying to measure those targets at the national reality in mind. I think it sounds like you guys are being very innovative in your approach, so that's great.
So to answer quickly to your question about where it's based on availability of data or based on national priorities, I would say that it was based on both. First of all, of course, as statisticians, we were looking at the availability of data sources, first of all, because it is not necessarily that we have chosen indicators for which we have already data, but at least we have a data source. Nevertheless, for the data sources for which we still have data, those indicators are produced because they are monitored. So they are object of the monitoring and evaluation tasks of the policymakers. That's why the existence of this data for the respective indicators is a confirmation of their belonging to priorities from the policymaking point.
Right, which comes back to the relevance and comparability point, which that's great. Thank you so much, Aurelia. So on to our next question, which is towards Claire in France. Claire, can you please explain a little bit about the evolution of national indicators in France? Did you work with other ministries to determine where these national indicators were required, or was it done by the NSO itself?
Thank you, Eleanor, for the question. I will try to explain before how the national list was defined before explaining its evolution. In France, at the end of the first 2017 semester, we decided to define a list of national SDGs indicators structured along the 17 SDGs goals, but taking into account the French national context. Indeed, some SDGs targets are already reached when, for some others, the policymakers and the civil society would like to go beyond. How do we proceed? A working group under the aegis of the National Council of Statistical Information, the CNIs, assisted by 2 reporters from the statistical system, was set up. The CNIs in France is a permanent forum for the consultation between producers and users of official statistics. The CNI, for instance, expresses the request for users in terms of production and dissemination of statistics. To enable productive debates on each of the 17 goals, it was decided to form a rather broad working group of 100 members from very diverse backgrounds: civil society, trade unions, associations, NGOs, local authorities, researchers and experts, observatories, producers of official statistics, the executives of central government ministries, and public establishments. The framework of the work had been fixed beforehand by a subgroup of 20 people, most of whom were appointed by the ministries to lead the policies related to SDGs and by the statistical system. The framework was the following. The indicators should be all political relevant and of a high statistical quality. The indicators should be already available or at least available in medium terms. The indicators should be easy to understand, no ambiguity, and no more than 6 indicators for a goal, and no more than a list of 100 indicators. A document was prepared by the statistical system to inform the working group of the global SDGs indicators already available, complemented by a list of other national indicators available and relevant in the statistical system in France. A mapping of the national policy with SDGs was also prepared by the different lines of ministries. It was to help the working group to make a selection from this list or others if they have something else to propose. The working group only proposed a list of 98 indicators deemed relevant to French strategies, expected to contribute to apply until 2030, and with robust public methods. Result and impact indicators were preferred wherever possible over resource indicators, except in special cases such as the official development aid. In addition, the working group formulated recommendations such as introducing or improving methods for some indicators, increasing the frequency of certain output, or leading research work to illustrate certain phenomena contributing to sustainable development. But the list of national indicators was established in 2018 before the national roadmap for SDGs, which was defined in June 2019. This indicator list was useful to define the roadmap, but now need to be adjusted to better map the French roadmap. That's why a meeting of this working group, which is now postponed because of COVID, was planned this month to review this list, to adjust the list to the French roadmap for SDGs, and to take into account new statistical development with new indicators available. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. It sounds like you're very busy. It also sounds like France is very much exemplifying many of the best practices that we noted before, where you set some very clear selection criteria, you had a very clear approach and expectations, and it definitely sounds as though you took and embraced a whole society approach. So thank you so much. Our last question, sorry, not our last question. Our next question goes to Amit from Israel. In the context of Israel and the Israeli National Indicator Framework, we noticed that many of the indicators are based on the Global Indicator Framework. However, there are several that differ. And we're wondering if you can explain how Israel determined what the national indicators would be, where they differed, and were these more proxy measures because the data produced did not fully match the metadata for the Global Indicator Framework, or are those more representative of national realities?
Hi, thank you. Well, first of all, I think all the answers are correct, but I think the main reason that most of the indicators in the Israeli list are from the global framework is that the national indicator framework in Israel is still work under development. So it's still being developed, and also it's a bit stopped now because of the crisis. But the national indicator framework is supposed to be based, is very strongly supposed to be based on policy relevance. So we are looking to tackle issues that are related to what we are dealing with as the strategic issues for Israel for the coming years, issues like housing, aging of the population, managing natural capital, exploiting innovation potential, and developing regional employment centers, and more strategic issues like that. So the list will probably change. So when we look at the list as it is today, those proxies are, so we started actually working practically. And from the Central Bureau of Statistics perspective, we looked at the global list and looked, okay, let's check what's relevant and leave out what's not relevant. And then what still we believe is relevant is, and we need to develop, and we don't have the available data, then we went to proxies that we can collect. So that was the basic approach. And there were also cases where we saw that indicators are not relevant, but we can develop specific indicators that are nationally relevant for us. And then there was more interaction between us and a specific government ministry that was connected to the specific target or goal. And then we developed specific indicators related to a certain policy that is on the table, and we saw that there was an opportunity to develop indicators for them. But the basic starting point for us was the global list, and just because in our case, I think the indicators, they came before the targets and the goals, and we started working long before policy and decision makers started to think about how to implement Agenda 2030 in our national policy. So it's like, that was the basic process.
Great, thank you. I think it sounds, actually, it's funny, it sounds very similar to our experience. So as I mentioned, here in Canada, we're also in development stages. So perhaps we'll have to ask you again about that as time goes on. So thank you, Amit. Our next question and final question for this component goes to Dovlet in Turkmenistan. The way that your national reporting is structured is directly aligned to the indicator framework, unlike others who have adopted the indicators customized. What factors did you consider when establishing this position?
Okay, good evening. This is Safiya speaking from Turkmenistan, and I will try to answer to this question. Indeed, we try to adapt all the global indicators, and Turkmenistan was one of the first countries who adopted the SDG indicators as they are, and we called it a super march when we spent 17 days reviewing the global framework. And we gathered together statistical office, different ministries, private sector, NGOs, in order to understand which of the indicators and which target will be the most relevant for the Turkmenistan priorities. At that time, we already achieved some noticeable progress on MDGs, so we decided to review what we have now as a data for the new SDGs, and we realized that almost 30% of the indicators were available and comparable with the global database. Since we decided to strengthen the comparability with the global databases, we decided to adapt as much as possible the global indicators. Currently, we adapted 175 indicators, and we regularly review it at the working group level that is gathered at the level of deputy ministers, and also involves parliaments, NGOs, and private sector, and we discuss what is the progress and how we can further improve our statistical and reporting progress on SDGs. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Safiya. I'm going to hand it over back over to Kara, and she'll summarize this section.
Thanks, Eleanor. So I think we can see that there's kind of been a diversity of how national indicator frameworks have been developed, but that countries are working and NSOs are working to develop indicator frameworks that respond to their own national priorities. In some cases where they can't measure the global target with the global metadata, they're proxying it to be able to measure as close as possible. So I think that that's great. Just keeping track of time, I'm going to turn it right over to Miriam, and she's going to take on the second part of this and talk about the voluntary national reports. So thank you, Eleanor. Thank you to all of the participants for this part of the webinar. And Miriam, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kara. Do you see the slides first off?
Yeah, we see them.
Thank you. So now coming to the second part of the webinar on voluntary national reviews, VNRs short. Well, what awaits us, as Kara already pointed out in the beginning, I will start us off with a short overview of the VNRs, and then we have two presentations lined up that I'm really excited about. We will be hearing more about the national experiences in Turkmenistan from Douglas, and about Israel's experiences with VNRs by Amit. And following, we will have the second part of the country interviews, and as well as some Mentimeter questions for you throughout. So if you have any questions or you want to contribute insights and experiences, please feel free to use the chat at any time. What are VNRs? VNRs are part of a follow-up and review of the 2030 agenda. They are carried out at the high-level political forum, the HLPF, that is the main UN platform for sustainable development. And the VNRs are expected to serve as the basis for regular reviews at the HLPF. It's important to point out that VNRs are voluntary and country-led, and the aim is to share experiences, including successes, but not only, challenges, lessons learned, and all with a view to accelerating the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So what's a review? Already in 2015, there were voluntary common reporting guidelines prepared by the Secretary General, the aim being to achieve more comparability between VNRs. And besides these voluntary guidelines, there is UN data, provides a detailed handbook for the preparation of voluntary national reviews. And there are many encouragements or requirements for VNRs. For example, that member states are encouraged to involve stakeholders in the process, and that VNRs are to have a focus on the most vulnerable groups. But coming to the, let's say, important part, from a statistical point of view, VNR countries are encouraged to provide as much as possible analysis based on statistics and indicators. How to do that is up to each country, be it by illustrating the main elements of the review with figures, showing trends, for example, or by including statistical annex on global SDG indicators or priority indicators identified at the national or regional level. The Canadian Council for International Cooperation every year publishes an independent assessment of the VNRs submitted to the HLPF. And based on their assessment, the next few slides give a brief overview over current trends and emerging best practices over all the VNRs submitted so far. For time reasons, I will be highlighting only a few of them. Starting off, since the beginning, on average, 3/4 of the countries having submitted VNRs actually follow the Secretary General's voluntary guidelines. There's also a trend showing increasing compliance with the guidelines over the last year. Regarding national priorities, 83% of countries say that they have identified them, according to the VNRs over the last 3 years. But only 27% completed the process of developing national targets and indicators. This stands a bit in contrast with Kara's first mentioned question, where from our small sample, 80% of the respondents said that they had already developed national indicator frameworks. It seems we're pretty good, if I may say so. According to the VNR submitted over the last 3 years, on average, 60% of the countries have integrated SDGs into policies, and with these policies being informed by data and or baseline assessment. Here also, this trend is increasing, with 80% of the countries having done VNRs in 2019, reporting having done this integration of SDGs into policies. But I also want to point out that more than half of the countries did not assess the full set of SDGs. There was often a focus on the social dimension. And over the same period of time, so the last 3 years, 75% of the countries provided information on review processes, including follow-up on the national level. Here also the trend is increasing. Coming to the topic of data. By the way, in the UNDESA's handbook, the words data and statistics are contained a total of 78 times. Taking into account that the handbook has only around 60-ish pages, I would say that's a lot. And also, it was quite interesting to discover that NSOs are named in the first item of the checklist that the UNDESA handbook provides for VNR preparation. So some pretty strong signals there. But back to the results of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation on the VNRs. Over 77% of the countries over the last 3 years reported that they have done an assessment of policies, data, or both. So very strong signal regarding data assessment. Half of the countries reported also on data availability. And as is to be expected, disaggregation is a big challenge for most of the countries. Coming to the question of the actual use of data in the VNRs, as you can see, the share of statistical annexes included in VNRs has significantly increased over the last years, reaching a total of 72% in 2019. And on average, regarding reporting, 36% of the countries regularly publish national reports, and 21% use dashboards or web portals to report on data. Both figures are increasing with 40% and 26% respectively in 2019. Regarding the data use, on average, 2/3 of the countries placed an equal emphasis on all dimensions of sustainable development. Some placed a special emphasis either on the economic or the social dimension, and almost none placed an emphasis on the environmental dimension. Well, this was the short overview from my side. Before giving the floor over, I have a short Menti-Vita question for you. Stella, could you share?
Yes.
Thank you. So the question is that the NSOs in your country play a role in the development of the VNR. So far, we have a lot of yeses. So far. So as it's not presented in percentages, I would guess it's about 90-something percent, 95% of where countries or the statistical offices were involved in the development of the VNR. So a pretty strong vote here, especially if we compare it to the data I just presented, where about 72% last year included a statistical annex, which we could use as a kind of reference value. So thank you very much for your voting. Up next, it's time to hear something about Turkmenistan experiences. David, the floor is yours. David, if you want to go ahead.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Yes.
Can you see our screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Dear participants of the workshop, colleagues, the State Statistics Committee of Turkmenistan is the main state institution that coordinates and leads the statistical work in the country. Turkmenistan is responsible for the data collection methodology on SDG indicators, metadata, development of the database. Now, let me briefly outline the measures implemented in the country starting from the adoption of SDGs until present time. On September 20th, 2016, the government of Turkmenistan adopted 187 SDG indicators. Turkmenistan has become the first country in the region and one of the first few countries who adopted the SDG indicators into their national development programs. On September 1st, 2017, the Scientific Methodological Center on SDGs was opened at the National Institute of International Relations under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The objectives of the center include training activities on the SDG implementation, preparation of curricula and their introduction in secondary, higher education institutions, development of methodological aid on SDGs. The matrix was developed to identify agencies responsible for each SDG indicator, segregated by elements of the measurement system. Elements of the measurement system were as follows: developing methodology, collecting data, data processing, setting up the database, analysis, inception report, drafting SDG reports for national and international reporting system users. The following changes were introduced into national system of SDG indicators of national on August 16, 2018. The National Program on Socio-Economic Development until 2030 and the Program of the President of Turkmenistan of Socio-Economic Development for 2019 to 2025 are aimed at the achievement of sustainable development and made progress with SDGs implementation, one of the key priorities. Turkmenistan adopted 17 SDGs, 148 targets, of which 121 were determined without changes and 27 taking into account national priorities, and 175 indicators. The Ministry of Finance and Economy of Turkmenistan is a coordinating body as part of the working group. The State Statistics Committee of Turkmenistan is responsible for a methodology of state and departmental statistics, collecting state reporting and coordinating generation of data, as well as establishment of the SDG database. The work on introducing changes is underway as of December 2019. Number of SDG indicators is aggregated by responsible ministries and departments. As you can see, majority of indicators are calculated by the Turkmenistan. Achievements of Turkmenistan since the adoption of the SDGs. Outcomes in social policy improved. Market transformations received a new impetus. Measures of climate adaptation and mitigation strengthened. Positive indicators in providing the population with affordable and quality medical services and education. Improvement of health system, educational reform maintained. The socially oriented economic growth and green economic sectors, rational use of natural resources, and effective climate change adaptation are underway. Providing equal opportunities with full participation of women in economic, political, and cultural life of the country carried out. Turkmenistan works to strengthen coordination and implementation of SDGs. Turkmenistan priorities: ensure sustainable, diversified economic and financial development of the country. Rapid growth of target economic sectors with focus on new industries. Improve living standards of the population, people-centered social policy, and growth of the human capital aimed at fair distribution of prosperity. Rational use of natural resources, environment protection, addressing universal climate change. Based on national priorities on 14th of March 2020, Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework between the Government of Turkmenistan and United Nations 2021 to 2025 was signed to further cooperate with UN agencies on strengthening the statistical and data capacities. Statistics and data are cross-cutting topic across all planning and monitoring activities under the national plans and programs. Turkmenistan is constantly working on developing on improving statistical capacity, methodological support, baseline data collection assessment, and support for the development for the SDG database. The computation of the multiple indicator cluster survey, mix 2018. Development of the institutional capacity of the State Statistics Committee. Development of a data management information system, health and education sector. Turkmenistan has presented VNR of 2019. The process started from the creation of interagency working group consisting of representatives of government agencies with the active participation of UN agencies, academic and private sector, and public organizations. Basis for the VNR was book of the President Gurbanguly Muhammad, Turkmenistan on the way to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which highlights the steps and actions taken by Turkmenistan to achieve the goals and objectives in the field of sustainable development. Rapid integrated assessment conducted with support of UNDP identified that from 148 targets, 124 or 84% comply with the current socio-economic policies of the country. During the VNR preparation, Turkmenistan applied innovative methods of the analysis of interconnection between goals. This was the first ever workshop conducted by UNESCO of such kind. Overall, the VNR process revealed that Turkmenistan is in a right direction in realization of SDGs, and it will support strengthening Turkmenistan's position in the efforts of international relations at global and regional levels. Turkmenistan has a strong social policy, achieved positive results in this area, in particular in the field of health and education. The need is identified for strengthening state policy in the economic sphere in context of countries' transition to market relations, as well as in the field of creating a sustainable financing mechanism for the SDGs. Turkmenistan will continue to work closely with the international organizations and UN agencies to further integrate the SDGs into national plans and update sectoral and regional plans and strategies. Turkmenistan will continue to collect comprehensive, disaggregated, and reliable data through thematic sample surveys. Turkmenistan will continue to work on creating SDG database, taking into account international experience. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us, Dovlet, especially at such a late hour for you.
Thank you.
I do have a follow-up question to you or to Sophia. You mentioned the development of a national system of indicators. Were they also included into Turkmenistan's VNR? That is to say that the VNR didn't include any data?
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, sure. For the VNR, the national indicators were included based on the selected SDGs for this year.
Thank you, Sophia.
Yes.
I would like to pose the same questions to all of you. So, Stella, could you pull up the next message slide? So, in case the NSO played a role in the development of your country's VNR, did your VNR include data, for example, statistical annex, and where was this data drawn from? Stella, could you share the Mentimeter slide? So far we have 50% that have data included that are drawn from global as well as national indicator frameworks. And 95% that include data as a total. That's a lot. Just wait another minute to get the possibility to respond. But so far, 96% include data, and most of them both include data from the global SDG indicator framework as well as from the national indicator framework. So thank you very much for voting. Up next, we will be hearing something about Israel's experience with VNRs. Amos, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to share. Okay, so are you seeing the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. So good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everybody. I'm going to talk today about the Israeli process of preparing the VNR. And specifically, I want to focus on the role of statistics and the National Statistical Office in the process, and the contribution of this process to national SDG statistics, to international SDG reporting, to strengthening the national statistical system, and making SDG indicators as relevant as possible to national policy. So Israel's VNR that was submitted in 2019 is its first VNR. And following the guidance of the Israeli government, an interministerial committee was formed, and consultation took place for over a period of 18 months in order to prepare a report that includes all relevant information and data concerning sustainability and the implementation of Agenda 2030 in Israel. So this team was headed jointly by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Environmental Protection. And there were members in this team from almost all government ministries, from the academia, NGOs, and the private sector. So what were the roles of this committee? It had two main roles. Maybe I'll start from the second one. That was, of course, the main role to prepare the VNR and to coordinate all work related to making a comprehensive report. And the second one, and that is more for the longer run, to set the foundations for implementing the goals within the national policy. This preparation of Israel's first VNR actually provided an opportunity to introduce Agenda 2030 across government ministries, authorities, and organizations. And for several of them, for some of them, it was actually for the first time. So it was very relevant for us to create this setting, also from the statistical perspective and also from the policy perspective. So in fact, this committee that was formed for the VNR was the actual real beginning of a national SDG mechanism. Okay, so the structure and contents of the VNR. So the main part of the report is the report of progress, goal by goal, with emphasis on policy relevance. And that's related also to something I said before in the answer to the question from Eleanor. The policy relevance is to make the SDGs linked with national strategic issues, such as the housing issue and the aging of population, managing natural capital. So make the SDGs relevant on the national level. So in the chapters, each chapter tries to make the connection between SDGs, between the targets, and those strategic issues, which are, all of them are highly relevant for achieving the SDGs. There is also a special focus, special attention in the report to innovation as a means for achieving the general goal of leaving no one behind. Based on the belief that innovation is a key engine for economic growth and well-being, the report focuses on efforts in Israel for making innovation inclusive and accessible for all. This includes, for example, innovative programs to enable work opportunities to groups in Israel with low participation rate in the workforce, using technological innovation to expand opportunities for people with disabilities, and so on. Also, the report contains a chapter, which is an annex also, of a contribution by non-governmental stakeholders, that they also took part in the discussion of the Interministerial Committee, and they were, you could say they were partners in all the discussions, and they also made their own contribution that is part of the report. And last but not least, the statistical annex that was under the direct responsibility of the ICBS, the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics, and which is actually as long as all the other parts of the report. So, before I talk more about the statistical annex and the VNR, some words about the general role of the ICBS with regards to SDG statistics. So the ICBS is the national focal point for SDG indicators reporting on the international level. And for this, we are responsible for mapping data availability, reporting data available in the ICBS, coordinating within the National Statistical System reports of all available data in other organizations, and also coordinating the construction of a national SDG database. So with regards to this, I just wanted to say that the nature of SDG statistics and indicators, it actually goes beyond, a lot of time goes beyond what is available within the National Statistical Office. So a big part of what we do with regards to SDG statistics is the coordination part, and identifying available data and identifying the relevant focal point within a government ministry that could help us to reach the data. So this is one of the challenges which is ongoing, and not only in the VNR process. And the VNR was actually played a major role in helping us tackle this challenge of coordination by creating this interministerial committee. So the role of the ICBS in the VNR, as part of our work on the report, we were able to improve the mapping of all available data within the NSO, within the National Statistical System, and beyond what we consider as official statistics. We were also able to share our knowledge with all the relevant partners in a much more comprehensive and integrated way. And this is also related to something that was said in one of the webinars last week about an NSO not only sharing data, but sharing knowledge that helps policymakers use the data better and use the data correctly, and fulfilling what you can do with it. And it also helps us to identify duplications or contradictions in data that come from different agencies. We also provided guidance and statistical consultation services to anyone who incorporated data into their contributions to the report. And in some cases, it helped to develop new statistical measures that were more relevant on a national level. And our main role, as I said, was the editing and writing the statistical annex of the report. And now a little bit about the annex itself. Basically, three types of data. Data aligned with methodology and definitions of the global indicator framework, additional national official statistics, and additional data and information not part of official statistics, what we call here policy indicators or process indicators, usually the indicators that relate to things like legislation and all kinds of policy measures. And with regards to the additional national official statistics, what I would like to emphasize is that here we actually, in the statistical annex, we have an opportunity to be more flexible and add more data. And it's a national report, but it's reported internationally. So it gives us an opportunity to broaden what we report and to make our national report more data-oriented and more rich with data. And then from that, we can grow and maybe make adjustments and even the additional national official statistics, make it more aligned with the global definitions. So overall, in the statistical annex, there are 113 indicators. 88 of them are based on ICBS data, and for 31 indicators, we have relevant disaggregations for the indicators based on available data. What we also try to do wherever it was possible, since it's, as I said, it's a national report for the international community, make as much as we can international comparisons of the data. So this is just an example of the layout of the statistical annex, charts, and short analysis of indicators and disaggregations. And this is how it looks throughout the report. So coming to the challenges and lessons learned. So first of all, with regards to statistical coordination, and I talked a little bit about that before, one of the lessons that we learned, and personally I learned from the work, is that the NSO needs to be involved in all coordination issues related to statistics in the VNR. Since we were directly responsible only for the statistical annex, so during the work it became apparent to us that there are several inaccuracies in the data presented in other chapters of the report, and some discrepancies and contradictions compared to data included in the statistical annex. So, and it became clear to us while we were working on the report, and it was a bit like you might say two separate reports in one, two in one, what you call. This is something that I think the country has to create a setting in which the NSO or any other organization appointed responsible for the data can coordinate all statistical activities. This is something that, like I said, we didn't do well enough. And I think it's something that has to be part maybe even of the basic guidelines for VNRs, especially if a country decides to include a statistical annex. Second point, using the statistical annexes for international SDG reports. So as I mentioned before, a VNR statistical annex can serve as a platform where all available SDG indicators of a country are concentrated in one place. And given the necessary adjustments, it could serve as a platform for reporting data to custodian agencies. From our personal experience, we found sometimes that not all what we see and consider as available for us is considered as available internationally. So I think it's worth examining if it's possible to create some kind of mechanism by which the custodian agencies can identify together with the country at a given year that it's preparing its VNR, the relevant information that can be added and the adjustments needed. It could save time, it could be efficient, it just needs some thinking about the mechanism that is needed. Regarding the platform for national statistical system capacity building, this is one of the main contributions of the governmental VNR process, because it helped to make significant improvements in all coordination activities of collecting and reporting SDG indicators, including for quality of information concerning availability, relevance, and development needs for the future. So it served, in our case, to put the foundations for a national statistical system reporting mechanism for SDG indicators. And it's something that we didn't have before. So if you can use this process of a VNR to strengthen your national statistical system, this should be something that you think about when starting the process. And the major contribution for the long run of the VNR is the development of a national indicator framework. So following the preparation of the VNR based on the experience of the Interministerial Task Force, there was a government resolution in Israel on SDG indicators that was approved in July 2019, while we were presenting the VNR in New York. And this is the government resolution for sustainable development goals for improving governance and strategic planning processes. This government resolution guides all government ministries to develop policy-relevant indicators and mechanisms for publication and reporting under the guidance of the ICBS. Guides the ministries to integrate the goals in their strategic planning processes, to develop indicators based on ICBS and National Statistical System guidance, to define strategic goals for the indicators, and to report annually to the government, and to coordinate all international reporting as well with the Central Bureau of Statistics. So it's also making the agenda relevant on the policy level, and also making statistics much more coordinated when we report and publish nationally and internationally. So the work on implementation, which actually was meant to be done right now, will be focused on enhancing the relevance of the indicators by focusing on policy relevance and identifying policy relevant indicators that correspond with those strategic planning issues which I mentioned before. Because it's also one of the lessons from the VNR process, that when we dealt with issues that are not on the policy table and are not prioritized, also good quality data was very hard to find. So we're trying to make it relevant and trying to help policymakers see where some existing indicators are relevant to policy issues that they are dealing with. So I think that's it. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amit. First of all, if you want to put on your video, then we can also see you. It was really interesting to hear about VNRs as a means of coordination and of strengthening the NSS. And it seems to me that we have a question in the chat to you. So Sarah is asking.
Just a minute. I'm trying to put on my video.
Amit, maybe you first can turn off your sharing screen and then you can put on your video.
Okay.
Just stop sharing first.
Do you see me now?
Yes.
Okay.
So Sarah is asking if Israel has a centralized or decentralized statistical system, and whether ICBS has a role in coordinating the statistical system generated. You point to the fact that the VNR process has highlighted the need for coordination. I think this is true for NSOs that already have a coordinating role and for those that have not previously. I just wanted to understand the challenges in this regard.
Okay, so first of all, the system in Israel is a centralized system, and the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel has a central role in the national statistical system. We are the coordinators of the activity of the national statistical system, and we actually try to use the SDG statistics process to, as I said, to strengthen the national statistical system. The challenges are very great because although we are Central Bureau of Statistics and we are coordinating most of the statistical activity, there are a lot of statistics that come from other ministries, and it's very complicated sometimes to coordinate the activity. We can see it today, things that data that comes from the Ministry of Health, for instance, and creating one national statistical official picture is a very complex task. What I can say from the example of the VNR for the SDGs is that when we sat in that interministerial committee, many times the representatives of other government ministries that were part of that committee, they were not really those who are in charge of statistics in their office. They were more in charge of strategic planning, policy. So even within other government ministries, they didn't always know what data they have available. And sometimes they found through us what data they have available within their offices. So you need, like, we understood we need to create a statistical focal point within the national statistics system in each government ministry. That could help us.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm sorry to say that we're running out of time. We only have 7 minutes left. So we had planned a lot of country interviews, but I think we won't be able to do them all. So I'm just asking all the presenters that should be or would have been answering questions if we could do maybe a short tour de table, saying in Germany we have a saying that after the game is before the game. Besides football, I think that might also apply to VNRs. So after VNR is before the VNR. So if you want to share with us, each of you, based on your experience and your lessons learned, do you have any good resolutions for the next VNR? And please be brief. And share your video if you're talking. Thank you.
So if I may, Aurelia, Moldova, because it was my turn to answer the question, right? So I would make this brief as you suggested. I am happy that for the National Bureau of Statistics of Moldova, in fact, even if it was a big challenge to produce this information on the basis of the national monitoring and evaluation framework or framework of SDG indicators, it was a difficult task for us, and it lasted more than one year. Nevertheless, I understand that for our institution as a coordinator of National Statistical Office, the production and the development of the VNR is in fact an opportunity for us to strengthen our coordination role, because only due to this exercise we succeeded to get in touch and in contact much more than usual with the owners of data sources, and to demonstrate our leadership on the topics of statistical methodologies and setting up of such monitoring and evaluation indicators. So as the biggest challenge for Moldova, I would say that we had a very short time to develop this VNR because our country has started this process only in November. So and only in January, the de facto writing of the report has started. And we are happy as statisticians being part of the process of reviewing of all the chapters of VNRs. We will have the focus on developing the chapters of VNRs based on the 5 pillars of 2030 agenda. So planet, prosperity, people, peace, and partnerships. So statisticians are providing their feedback on all the chapters of this process. And of course, for us, it will be a lesson learned on how to work with our other national data producers and how to organize and coordinate such a big process at the national and the subnational level. Thank you very much to our moderators. You were the best, in my view, from the previous sessions, and I would participate in such type of sessions with pleasure in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aurelia. Can we get a short statement also from Amra from Bosnia-Herzegovina? Would have been nice to hear a lot from you since you're the only participant not coming from a national statistical office, but please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, in regards with the VNR, I mean, I would also like to say that the questions on the statistical annexes, that we actually really was challenging for us to incorporate it because, well, first of all, we found in a handbook for the writing on VNRs that the SDG annex was not really an, let's say, obligatory part, but also it didn't have such a good explanation how should it be developed like the other parts had it. So some of my recommendations would go in that direction. So we actually spend a lot of time and effort to reviewing others' VNRs and trying to find the pattern in the submitted, already presented VNRs. So we actually realized that the pattern is that if the country doesn't have a national indicator framework or national strategy, they didn't report on statistical annexes. And when they report in statistical annexes, they were usually giving the targets. So they already set some targets, and that really kind of made sense to do it. So in the, let's say, like to fulfill this gap that we had, we didn't want to neglect the data. Luckily, National Statistical Office just published the report on sustainable development and available indicators, and we actually used those in the part of goals and targets. So, for example, if you see our VNR for 2019, you would see that more than 50% of the document was devoted to goals and targets and to quantitative data. So,
thank you very much, Amra. And with the last minute left, I think we're going to go a bit over, so please bear with us. Alex, last but not least, do you want to share something with us?
Yes, hello. Hello, Miriam. I'll try to be brief. I can confirm everything that Amit has said about statistical coordination. It's a lot of work. We do our first VNR this year, so it's just the experience we have for this VNR. We were supposed to do a statistical annex first, but now we do a statistical chapter within the VNR. What was a lot of coordination, a lot of work, a lot of talking to people and refining. Because on the one hand, there's statistical independence. That's very important, and you should keep it. On the other hand, there's political speech. So like in statistics, we would say poverty went down from 17 to 15%. Now it says Austria was able to reduce poverty from 17 to 15%. That's still correct, but another type of speech. And that was very interesting to learn about that. And what I would advise everyone is when doing a VNR, the cooperation between Statistical Bureau and politics should be very close, and it should start as early as possible. So thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear about the challenges related to languages. First of all, a big thank you to all our presenters, Alex, Amit, Amra, Angela, Aurelia, Claire, Douglas, Eleanor, and for sharing their experiences. And I'll try to do a attempt summary for the VNR session before giving over to Kara for a small summary on her part. So, good news first. It seems that VNRs have been becoming progressively more data-focused over time. One thing we've heard is that cooperation and coordination with regards to VNRs, but also in general, is key. And as Amit pointed out, good quality data seems to be easier to obtain when there is a political need for it. So here a clear appeal to promote data-based decision-making. Therefore, a call to strengthen the role of NSOs, and especially the important role the statistical offices play with regards to quality assurance. And last but not least, we have heard the repeated emphasis, also from you, Alex, that statistical independence is key. So much from my side. I just want to point out that if you want to know more, please have a look at all the materials provided on the webinar's website. As you have noticed, we couldn't go through all of it, and there are many things to be found online. So over to you, Kara, for your last words.
Thank you, Miriam. Okay, so thanks to everybody today for joining us and staying with us as we tried a new format. So just to conclude on the National Indicator Frameworks, I think that the development of National Indicator Frameworks for SDGs that we examined showed that most countries took a whole of society approach, and they used a combination of global indicator frameworks and nationally developed indicators to try and measure their priorities. They tried to also use existing data and were extremely pragmatic, balancing simplicity with completeness. So I think overall, from everything that we've seen, that kind of is the conclusion, and that those are best practices as well. Also, much like the VNRs, having a clear role in the development of national indicators is key. So I'd finally just like to thank everybody for logged on, and for those who participated in the Mentimeter questions. Again, this was an experiment on our part, and we really appreciate you trying that with us. So thank you very much. And Tina, I'm going to turn it over to you if there's anything else you'd like to say.
Yes, thank you, Kara. Thank you, Kara and Miriam, both for very interesting and although a little bit experimental, but I think the experiment worked quite well. Such an interesting session. It's a pity that now we have to disconnect because of the time, but I think in a way maybe this is a kind of an appetizer for a section on national indicators and in the roadmap on statistics for SDGs, for which we are preparing the second edition. And also there will be a part there dealing with VNRs. So I would like to thank everybody for participation. Thank all the presenters and countries who shared their experience through the interviews. And then most of all, of course, the great moderators that we have. And with this, just to say that then we have still one webinar coming, which will be on tomorrow, at starting at 3 o'clock Central European Summer Time, so the same time. And tomorrow webinar will be a little bit more technical, dealing with data transmission and regional reporting, and especially about this things like SDMX and those technical tools that you need to transmit data. So with this, goodbye to everyone. The recording will be available afterwards on the web, and please join us again tomorrow. So thank you and